I think it's a continuation of what people have been working towards. I mean, we're happy with the fact that we were the first to directly use it in humans and on the skin, but there have been a few where people have used specific bacteria for gut-based disease and found improvements. So I think it's just a continued expansion to say this is a viable treatment option for patients, and so expand people's view from like the traditional pharmaceutical design to using these kind of therapies. So at the NIH, we license these things out to the private sector once they hit a certain point. From that moment on, we don't have any direct control over the cost. But with that said, the way that the biologics are derived, by their nature, are always going to be expensive. The way this is derived, you can grow it in an easy bake oven. And so, you know, you wouldn't want to do that at home because you want to keep it sterile and keep it safe, keep the dose right. But it's just so much cheaper to manufacture that it's going to have to translate to lower cost. And our therapy was also for a shorter duration. We weren't planning to treat people for their whole life. It may be necessary, but it just should be cheaper for that reason too. So in the adults, we only gave them enough to treat a couple of body sites. With the kids, they got to treat their whole body. Because in the very beginning, we had kicked around the idea of treating one arm but not the other. But we were nervous about what would happen if there was some kind of passive transfer between them, and then your placebo arm isn't really your placebo arm anymore. And so we decided, no, let's just treat everybody. But you know, so if somebody treated their arms, they got better. But if they didn't treat, let's say their legs didn't get better. So it really was localized to where the treatment was. A lot of people have commented that hand disease might be a different beast altogether. So there's lots of possibilities. Either we're using the wrong bacteria for the hand, we're using the wrong dose, maybe hand disease won't respond to bacteria at all, and maybe it truly is a completely different pathway. But yeah, even people who had dramatic improvements in their arm, all of 8 inches removed, had nothing happen, no improvements on the hands. And that's, we're surprised by that, and we'll work to try to figure out why that might be. I do think in the future, you know, one of the things that we are looking at is genetic sequencing the people and then their bacteria. And so I do think that there'll be a situation in which there's an ideal bacteria for each given individual. There'll be broad categories. It's not going to be one-to-one. But we haven't seen any major ethnic differences in terms of collecting healthy bacteria from different people. We tend to get the same bacteria from healthy individuals. But I do think that there'll be some subtle variations between groups. We have a few more patients who've enrolled who have parents who have long-term disease, so maybe they'll respond. That'll be the same kind of thing where we want to look at their genetics, and once we get their genetics, what might end up happening is kind of a screening tool where you'd say if you have an obvious genetic cause for your disease, then this bacteria is not going to be your solution and you might need a different therapy. So I don't know if it'll be that because people can inherit bad bacteria from their families as well. So it could end up being that. So we don't know yet, but I wouldn't exclude the possibility of responding but it was obviously a pretty quirky finding that anyone with a family history were the ones that didn't seem to respond. They're starting the paperwork, but that's spearheaded by that private sector group, Forte, license it out. That's about all I know of that. But they're going to start their FDA communications, and so, you know, if you're an optimist, you'll say maybe the first patient will be enrolled in a year, probably closer to 2, something like that. I think one of the things to stress is that a lot of these diseases, and it's not just in the skin. I mean, you talk about the gut and all these, you know, any mucosal surface where you find a lot of the microbiome. You'll see a lot of studies that talk about complex genetics, and it'll be like, oh, this gene contributes or that gene contributes. And I do think it's important to highlight that the bacteria seem to be able to overcome even those genetic predispositions. And so the genes are a risk for the disease, and so by controlling the bacteria and the environment that you're in, you may be able to negate the genes. And I think it's important that patients know that that quote-unquote bad genetics does not resolve them to being stuck with this disease for the rest of their life.